One. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Come right on in, make yourself comfortable, well, virtually comfortable. We are glad to have you here with us for our November Learning Cafe. We're closing up with the third part of the series. If you've been with us, if you're newly joining us, we welcome you. Please feel free to throw your location in the chat. We want to know every region, East, North, West, and South, that we have attendees joining us for our Learning Cafe. It's always good to see how far the community spreads out. So put that right in the chat. We'd like to see it. I'm gonna put my location. Hey, Hillside, Syracuse. I'm Helen from Albany, New York, 518. We got some 518 locations in the place. Binghamton, good to see you. Put those places in the chat, keep it going. We like to keep it saved and brag and show it to everyone and say, look how in depth and how far spread our Learning Cafe community is. Harlem, we got Harlem, Delaware County, Hudson. Glad to have you, keep them coming. We're gonna give some time for our E&I director from ECLC to give a more formal introduction. But before we do that, Tucson, Arizona, good to see you. Before we do that, we want you to we're gonna do a compass, virtual compass today. Throw some landmarks, favorite places to go, parks, museums, libraries. I want some locations in the chat that we can share with one another, just in case we travel New York State or abroad, places that we can go. I'm gonna put my favorite park that I grew up in, Lake Placid. I like that. Here we go, Bronx Zoo, Thatcher, Lake Placid. We got another one for you, Columbia. Keep them coming, keep them coming. Just a minute and we will get the formal introduction going. Ithaca, New York, glad to have you. Rafting on Delaware River, trout fishing. We'll keep that in the archive. Grafton Lake. Ooh, Aruba. Ooh, okay. We got some tropical places going, some islands, some things like that. Thatcher Park, Empire State Plaza is a great one. Alicia Kill Park, Kensington Gardens, London, England. We are all over the world with that. I wonder, Palm Springs, California, glad to have you. Please make yourself comfortable. And thank you for your time and for all the shared resource and location. We definitely gonna try to compile that and keep us in place where we can share it. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Fanny Glover, our Director of Equity Inclusion at the Early Care and Learning Council. Fanny, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Elijah. I'm telling you, is he amazing or what? He is truly the person that is I think the epitome of the greeting world, okay? So before we get started, what I'd like to do is play homage and honor acknowledgement. We honor the land as the Creator intended. In that, and this is from Indigenous prayer, we honor the land as the Creator intended, in that we commit to keep it clean and support efforts to make it safe for all. We all can show honor to the native keepers of the land by recognizing the value of their culture, by learning the truth of their history and how it shaped this great country. So this is just a wonderful beginning that we try to start all of our sessions with. If you've been with us for the first two sessions, you know that you're in for an amazing time today as well. And this particular session is about the impact of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor on diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and the change, the stagnation, and next steps. We've gone through part 1 and part 2 with Dr. Crawford, and in part 2, Dr. Wycoff joined her, and they talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging, and how it has stagnated along with barriers to anti-bias work for white people and members of the BIPOC community. Today, which is our final session, and I don't know about you, but I've been enjoying this so much. It's like, oh, we should have made this 5 sessions. But today is our third and final session with Dr. Crawford on this particular series, and where she's going to provide concrete recommendations for anti-bias work that shifts from emotion-driven to value-driven strategic sustainable action. For those of you who've not had the luxury of hearing her, I'm going to give you a very quick snippet of her background. Dr. Crawford, Dana Crawford, is a pediatric and clinical psychologist. She is a developer of the Crawford bias reduction theory and training, a systemic approach to reducing bias, prejudice, and racism. She has a thriving private practice in Manhattan, New York, to no surprise. She has certifications in medical hypnosis and biofeedback. She has treated patients with high incidence of trauma in Philadelphia, Cincinnati, New Orleans, San Antonio, the Bronx, and New York. She's a graduate of Howard, Temple, and Miami University, and has degrees in the areas of counseling, African American studies, psychology, and the arts. She has a certification in the practical nursing as well. Finally, she completed her pediatric psychology residency at the Tulane University School of Medicine, a 2-year clinical fellowship with the United States Department of Defense, and a 2-year fellowship with the Center for Early Connections at Tulane University. In recent years, she has worked with the National Black Caucus to create legislation for Black maternal health equity and appeared on a plethora of news platforms, conducted over 100 trainings and presentations nationally in private, public, and government sectors. I have no idea how many people are inside of this one being, and I have no idea how she get all of this done, but we're glad she's here with us. I yield the floor to you, Dr. Crawford.
Thank you so much, Fanny. I mean, the combination of you two, I feel like you should just be like the hype people standing on the side of my bed when I wake up in the morning, right? Like Elijah, like, yep, that's her bio. And Fanny, the enthusiasm and just the kindness in which you always introduce me. I appreciate you. And I really appreciate the way that you open up this space with honoring, So I've heard so many ways that we are trying to honor. And I think that many of us don't know the way. And I appreciate your example in this way. And I just had to close my eyes and just hear your words. I invite you all today, if possible, to try and be present. I've started saying I have 3 things that I invite people to do, and that is to, move your pen or your pencil, move your jaw, and then move into action. Now today, we'll have a question and answer period at the end for you to move your jaw, but I hope that you write down some things, and I hope you write down some things that you really like and some points that I make. But I also hope that I hope you write down some things that you don't like, some things that you're like, oh, that's a different way. That's not really my way. This conversation that I've created for us today is really about that space in which we don't always agree. So often I find myself doing these presentations and I use a lot of we's and we're here because I want us to join together. But I also recognize that there has been this culture created where people don't have different points of views. We can't share those points of view. And yesterday, this became glaringly obvious for me. And I'll talk a little later about what happened that made me shift this presentation and say, you know what, I need to write some slides on this whole thing. So let's go ahead and get us started. And then at the end, I have a really special treat for us to wrap up our 3-part series. So if you know me, if you've ever seen me anywhere, I love me a QR code. And a QR code, I use it for a variety of reasons, but the main reason is because I don't want you to wait for my slides. Here are the QR codes, pull it up on your phone. My resource is your resource. And this one, I started us off with my favorite charity of choice. And I'm on the advisory board for the door, and they serve thousands, about 7,000 to 15,000 youth around New York City and the surrounding boroughs. So I invite you all to learn more about the door, but also please pay attention to the QR codes as we go along if you like the resources that I share. So this third part series, and I am so thankful for Fanny and Elijah holding this space. There comes a time when you've given so many trainings, and my bio said over 100 trainings, it really needs to be updated. I need to send you a new one, Fanny, because in this year alone, I think I've done about 200. In 2021, I'm notorious for not updating my CV, but it feels about that number. I give about 4 to 8 trainings a week. And when you get to this point where you have created so much content, it can start to become a bit redundant, and you share the same things, you make the same jokes, you share the same examples, some of the pictures get replicated. And that to me is really scary, not just for my audience and for people who are interested in new material from me and new content and for me to be learning, but it's scary because that's where I could build a space of being apathetic and not caring, because it becomes like muscle memory as opposed to like fresh and challenging and really making me think about ways that I can be innovative. So this talk today is that, I've never given it anywhere before. Some of the material, yes, but not in this way. So if it's not seamless, I appreciate your grace in advance. So where should we begin this talk? And you all know I love to start the talk with a cultural consciousness wave, but I really want to hone in on the 2020 cultural consciousness wave. So in 2020, everyone, I'm saying, like some people were already there, but we got more everyone's. We got more we's at the table, thinking about what is happening to Black people in this country, in this world. Really amplifying the work of Black Lives Matter, which was very much an organization and in effect well before 2020. And it really was sparked by the recorded murder. At the time, it was called an incident, but later we know it to be the recorded murder of George Floyd, and the murder, not just in 2020, but of several Black people. And this list is nowhere near, these are just the big names that got enough press for you to know their names, but we know that there have been hundreds of Black people that have been harmed. This isn't just Black people. I recognize that Asian hate in the ways that our Asian brothers and sisters and non-binary siblings have also suffered greatly because of racism and because of hate. And so in 2020, it was, the year of social justice and a call for social justice. And I think there really were 3 core reactions to these types of images, to these conversations. And the first was people really said, that's racism. When you think of Trayvon Martin, when you think of George Floyd, when you think of Breonna Taylor, you know very well that that wouldn't have happened or wouldn't as likely have happened if any of them lived in a different body, right? In a white body. And so people named a thing, and there was a whole movement and people started saying that's racism. Others looked at that recorded murder and other things that were happening, and they didn't say it wasn't sad. They looked at it as a general tragedy that, tragedies happen. It's horrible when a young paramedic is murdered in her bed, that George Floyd, was murdered, that Trayvon Martin was shot, that all of these things over time, these are tragedies, right? Heartbreaking, but it's not about race. Others viewed it as justice. Some of these people were criminals. Some of these people engaged in ways that were inappropriate. If they weren't doing these things, then these things wouldn't have happened to them. And then it was a population of people that were really just in their own world, right? Just live in their own world. And so the folks that were thinking that this was racism and understood it to be racism started to be, DEIB change agents, and really became the we that I'm often talking about. The people that showed up to all of my trainings in 2021, 2020, ones that knew me before, right? And people that were doing this work in their organizations, maybe even before 2020, or they got on board in 2020 and they came hard. They started developing different committees, joined groups. And then the folks that were in the general tragedy camp, they showed up, but in these spaces, they were quiet, right? But they were there. They showed up to the Zoom, they filled in those numbers, they observed, they learned, they sat, they were there. They might have asked a question or two. For the folks that were in their own world, some of them showed up, a lot of them were just silent. Where are they? I invited 40 people to this event, only 20 came. What happened to the other 20 on the Zoom? How can we predict that only 50% of people come to the Zoom that are invited, even though they RSVP'd, right? These are the folks that were kind of in their own world. And then the justice folks that thought these things that were happening were anchored in justice, started to make movements. And you would hear language like all lives matter, not just Black lives matter. They dug deep into the beliefs that they already held, that they were socialized in, maybe by the generation before them, maybe by their schools and the ways that they were educated, but they dug their heels into their previous knowledge rather than acquiring new. And they looked for things that confirmed their belief system. And so what were these folks doing? So the folks in the racism and the general tragedy camp were, going out and protesting and reading a lot of books, made all of these authors really, really famous, talked about these books, had book clubs, had conversations with family, did deep work, went to different diversity workshops and trainings, were doing that work. The folks that are in the justice camp, they were out there protesting too. They were saying all lives matter. They were reading books that confirmed their beliefs. They were watching things that confirmed their beliefs. They were tweeting things that confirmed what they saw, what they understood. And then the folks that were in their own world, they might have been, and I was some of these folks sometimes, the woman laying on the couch with all these toys and her laptop, they were trying to survive COVID, right? There was grief, there was death, there was burnout, there was compassion fatigue. It was, showing up on Zoom with a nice shirt on and sweatpants in the bottom, just trying to survive, right? And there's no judgment in these three different areas. I'm just laying it out, what people may have been experiencing at the time. And so for the folks that were in the DEI camp, this is racism or this is tragedy camp, we started to make these commitments, right? We started to make statements on our websites and all different types of accounts and different workshops and spaces like this, right? And you would see all variations of like what DEI means, right? People had to learn what DEI was. A lot of people before COVID, before the murder of George Floyd, nobody even knew what DEI was, right? And some people call it EDI. Someone today told me it was JEDI, which is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we made up all these nice acronyms and we made commitment statements, right? Like it's about showing up and I do it. And then it's my professional development and it's my priority, right? And it's a priority, not just for me, it's a priority for my colleagues. It's a priority for my world, for my community, for my institution. But we didn't acknowledge that everyone does not agree, right? Everyone doesn't agree with DEI. A lot of times I've even said, whoever shows up, those are the folks that we're engaging with. But as we think about 2022, that approach was sufficient in 2020. That approach was sufficient in 2021. But now we have to move forward. In this work, we have to challenge ourselves to make sure that we are being innovative and we are really getting the justice and the movement we need for this humanitarian crisis, which is racism, which is prejudice, which is bias. It harms people, it kills people. And so what I have found in many of these spaces is that people do not talk about different viewpoints. And when they do, they are corrected and not heard. So for instance, if someone says all lives matter, which I don't agree with that movement, it's often, well, let me tell you why Black lives matter, and this is the correct one. Not really giving the full space for someone to explore, to examine, to investigate, to interrogate their own belief systems in a space of mutual understanding and respect. And so the reason that I think often we don't have these conversations where people can disagree is because of cancel culture. So now we've gotten to this space where a person can be boycotted, they can be shunned from their community, from their world, because they say something that is objectionable, if I could say that word, and controversial. And this idea that if you say something that is not the mainstream movement, then you will be canceled. You are not allowed to say these words. And in some ways, it really does limit people's ability to explore what is happening inside. And the reason that cancel culture becomes such a significant thing for us to talk about, it's because people are afraid. And people get really afraid of saying what they actually feel what they actually think. And so they're silent, but still that thought is still there. And that thought is still going to lead to a certain behavior that leads to votes, that leads to policy, that leads to practices that have very huge ramifications. And so the reason this is so important for us to point out is because the things that we think about lead to our actions. And the things that we're thinking about are very much linked to our resources, right? We know that racism, prejudice, and bias are tools. They determine resources, they identify the ways we generate resources, how we replicate resources, and how we control resources. And so the big resources that were really activated and harnessed in 2020 were things like money and funding, and to start thinking about what that looks like in equity. Reputation and prestige becomes really important, especially as we think about cancel culture, right? And the fear that gets activated when people are saying what they believe to be true or their own thoughts, and they're not sure if it's true or not, but there's no space for them to actually talk about it. In hiring and promotion, who's allowed to be in what space and who's being promoted. I've seen so many organizations that say DEI work, we support it, we're aiming for diversity, but when you look at their board, it's all white folks, it's all white men, right? When they say we want diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's only the managers that are diverse, right? And so reputation and prestige and resources. It also has to do with hiring and promotion, and lastly, conflict. And that's the big thing here. People are so afraid of conflict. So recently, and I'm not going to disclose this corporation, even though I didn't sign an NDA, but just out of respect, recently being yesterday, I was asked to do a training, a DEI training. And I generally recognize that DEI trainings are not substantial for behavioral change. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But I agreed to do this training. And I said, if I do this training, I want to create a space where people can move their pens, move their jaws, and move into action, and not passive learning. So this space here today, although very valuable and important, you're still receiving information passively. You're listening, you might be writing. If you're writing, it gets a little bit more active. That's why I say move your pen so it can get active. But for the most part, you might be laying on your couch, at your computer, checking your email, doing something else where it's passive knowledge. And even if you're completely engaged with me, you're still not interacting with me. And so in this training, I said, it's required that I am able to have some level of interaction with your team. And they said, okay, we'll do a large group discussion. And I said, well, I really prefer breakout rooms. I'll give guidance for the breakout rooms. I'll give, parameters for how people can interact. I'll give some language when there is any conflict, but people need to get the material and then get a chance to move their jaw. They told me, no problem, we have some concerns about HR. HR may not want you to do the breakout rooms because you don't have someone in every single breakout room to make sure no one says anything offensive. And this is really interesting that the fear is that someone might say something offensive in a breakout room, because we all know in reality, people say things offensive in their emails, they say it in the coffee room, they say it in the actual Zoom. And so to not allow people to have conversation because you're afraid that someone would be offended limits the ability to actually engage in this content. And so they said, we're going to allow you to do the breakout rooms. That's the agreement. So I come to the training yesterday and I said, yes, check my slides. And this is how many people I want in the breakout room. And they said, absolutely not. We didn't approve breakout rooms. And I said, okay, let me bring up my receipts. And so I screen shared my email that said, yes, we could do breakout rooms. And they said, well, we're not doing breakout rooms. Just do it our way. And then we can talk about it later. And I said, absolutely not. And this is a conversation with a Black woman, myself, who has done many trainings. You heard my CV, no need to brag on it. And someone who does not have expertise. And for them to determine that I should not do the things that I believe are best practice based on fear. And so they created this space where the conversations were curated, that the conversations were limited, that people weren't even able to engage and explore what it means to actually have a tender conversation with guidance, with support, with some resources, but without anyone else saying you're not an adult enough to have a conversation. We have to start trusting that we can get through this, we can understand it, we can show up as full responsible adults. And if people don't, we also have to believe that we are capable of managing if people get dysregulated, right? And so when I talk about this space where people were moving forward in the DEI movement and recognizing the racism, recognizing the trauma, but yet not creating a space for communication about varying points, it ends up being an area that's a gap in the movement of DEIB work. The other thing that we ask people for, maybe even without their agreement, without them really saying, yes, this is what I want to show up for, we ask for their time, their energy, their health, you know, their motivation, their intellect, their labor, their resources. And this fear, you know, really comes down to this space that the dominant fear is that we are really worried. And then when I say we, it's a human thing. We're worried about the loss of the resources, some people call it privilege, I call it resources, that come with being white, with being male, with being able-bodied, with your class, and really this piece about morality, like I'm a good person. Like if I think of myself as a good person and I navigate good person and I'm a good person, good things should happen to me. And if we have to confront the fact that we are maybe not as good as we think we are, that we are flawed, there are resources in our energy that gets lost. If we have to confront the reality that I get certain things because I'm able-bodied, then that is a fear that gets activated. And we have to talk about this. The other piece that we haven't talked about is the ways that misinformation amplify that fear. And this is a video that I think does a really good job in talking about why we keep seeing a repetition of fake news and the ways that people dig deep in the things they already knew and already experienced without really exploring and interrogating their own thoughts and beliefs with new knowledge, with reflection.
Hey, come here. Did you know that RuPaul claims that Trump touched him inappropriately in the 90s? Or that Obama signed an executive order banning the Pledge of Allegiance in schools nationwide? Okay, we all know that that was some grade A, top shelf, premium fake news. But you knew that, right? You're way too smart and well-informed to fall for that BS. But what if falling for fake news isn't about intelligence or how much information you have? What if we're hardwired to believe what we want to believe, regardless of the facts? The 2016 presidential election saw fake news come out of nowhere. A BuzzFeed analysis showed that the top 20 fake news articles on Facebook generated more clicks than the top 20 real articles from every major publication combined. They were shared millions of times. And it's not that we're just sharing fake news, we appear to be believing the stories too. A recent poll found that people believe fake news articles were somewhat or very accurate 75% of the time. How can we be falling for fake news when we have these things? We have instant access to more information than we've ever had before. Debunking misinformation should be a piece of cake, right? Decades of brain research say, no. Turns out, our brains have other plans. A little something called cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is defined as a limitation in our thinking that can cause flaws in our judgment. It's kind of like an annoying brain glitch that can lead us to make faulty conclusions. Fake news often exploits this and our brains love it, even if we're not conscious of it happening. Once we form conclusions, they're hella hard to change, even if we're presented with facts or evidence that directly contradict those conclusions. So what exactly is going on in our brains to make us think that fake news is real news? Why can't facts change our minds? It also leads us to ignore or minimize facts that threaten what we believe. So here's a study that explains how it works. Back in 2004, during the Kerry Bush election, researchers studied a group of 30 people, half Democrat, half Republican. Both candidates did what politicians do. They flip-flopped on the issues. Then the study asked the participants to analyze what the candidates said. The participants let the candidate in their own party off the hook, but were super critical of the candidate in the other party. When researchers looked at their brain scans, they found that the area of the brain responsible for reason, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, was inactive. So people weren't using reason when evaluating the candidates they liked, but they were using the part of the brain that processes emotion, the orbital frontal cortex, a classic case of confirmation bias. And their brains were also rewarding them with the rush of dopamine, a neurotransmitter that makes you feel good. So is there any upside to confirmation bias? Well, it could help protect us from ideas that may threaten our social standing in our tribe. Dan Kahan, a law and psychology professor at Yale University, calls it identity protective cognition. We humans are hypersocial, so it's more important to protect our values in our relationships with family and friends than it is to risk losing that by adopting new beliefs. Are you familiar with Tomi Lahren? She's a conservative political commentator.
A protest is a peaceful objection to a grievance. A bunch of sore losers occupying a space is called a tantrum.
But recently, she expressed her pro-choice view on abortion.
No, I'm pro-choice, and here's why.
As a result, members of her conservative tribe turned on her. Ouch. So, how do we defeat confirmation bias? Well, you really can't, but our 3-step plan can help you get around it. Step 1 is recognize. Recognize that you have this bias in the first place. We all do. You made it this far in the video, so you can check that one off. Step 2 is consider. Consider that you may not really understand what you think you understand. Researchers call it the illusion of explanatory depth. Let's say I strongly believe that GMOs are bad for me. If someone forces me to explain it, I just might realize that I don't understand it as well as I thought I did. Now, I might be less confident in my belief and more receptive to another point of view. Step 3 is research. Research and break down the opposing viewpoint. You may realize that your understanding of where they're coming from is a bit too shallow. So now you know the perils of confirmation bias and have some tools to beat it. Let's try it out. Without being a smartass, pick a controversial topic and use step 3 on it. Don't try to persuade, but instead use research and facts to lay out why the other side believes what it believes. Put your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to good use, will you?
And so as we think about this concept of identity protective cognition, it becomes really critical as we're exploring what the next phase of DEIB work is. So for instance, how many of you can really explain why are people against critical race theory? What are the arguments against it and what does it mean for them? Why are people saying things like all lives matter? What is that argument about? In the same way that we know very clearly our beliefs and our standing points, it becomes critical if we are trying to connect, to understand, and to move and evolve, that we're also considering the other perspective. And considering it doesn't mean like, oh, maybe I'll be converted, but it's really about understanding. And I think this has been a critical issue and why we keep seeing waves and waves of cultural consciousness, but people don't change. It doesn't change behavior. In other words, we're existing in silos and we're staying in our own space. And if you've done any research about the ways that the algorithms and social media work, the emails that you get, even your friend circle, we know that people that are most similar, the ideas you're most similar to are the things that you're exposed to. We all used to, I remember, mute our microphones like, oh, I don't want Facebook to hear me because then I'll get an ad, right? All of these things are true. You will get a pocket of information that confirms what you believe over and over again. And as we think about our approach of doing more diversity training and seeking more diversity, this is inadequate with silos existing. When we think about diversity training versus the identity protective cognition, who is going to win this race? If I do a 90-minute training with you and someone else is looking at their internet for, let's say, 12 hours a week, one is going to confirm and the other is just going to be a little drop in the bucket. And so as we think about the ways that we need to be more innovative in DEIB work, it comes to this space of creating more conversations that are in spaces that may be uncomfortable, more conversations that might actually lead to conflict, but then also conflict resolution, more skills on how do you repair cultural ruptures, and how do we allow cultural ruptures to occur so cultural healing can happen. And so I think very clearly that fear discriminates, but misinformation perpetuates. And so we have to do something about these two components in this next wave of DEIB work. And so there's been so many studies that show that diversity training alone does not work. And the main reason that it doesn't work is, number one, is that we don't all agree. And many DEIB trainings do not allow for us to have discussions of different points of view. The other piece is bias, prejudice, and racism is historical, and systems need to be modified or dismantled, and a training is not going to dismantle a system. People need accountability to change those systems. Anyone here who has ever tried to change your lifestyle and exercise and eat healthy, you know you need some accountability in some level, shape, or form. And lastly, awareness, which many of the DEIB trainings do not bring behavioral change. I can know very well that eating nachos is going to raise my blood pressure. And guess what I love to eat? Nachos. They're my favorite, right? So awareness does not bring behavioral change. And so last time, or actually in the first of these 3 series, I talked about the critical component of integrating all 3 of these aspects into your DEIB work. More specifically, on an individual level and a personal level, you have to be learning anti-bias skills. Racism, prejudice, and bias is a system that is on autopilot. You don't need to turn it on, it's just there. So you actively have to do something to counter that system. But just knowing what to do does not matter if you don't implement it. And in this implementation, in this next wave, I'm challenging us to use those skills, not just to have wonderful conversations with people who are similar in our mindset, but instead with people that would be cancel eligible, right? Like in a regular world, if it was 2020, you would get canceled. Instead, I invite us to say, you know, instead of canceling this person, I'm going to really engage. I'm going to consider, and I'm going to try to really understand what's going on with them from their perspective and see if we can find a space that they're also willing to come with me to understand. And lastly, we have to have the accountability piece. So as we think about this cultural consciousness wave, many of us in this first wave were out here protesting and reading the books. In this next wave, what we're seeing is this concept that is known as white lash. And we've seen this happen over and over and over again. And it's because people do not come to the table to really have a conversation of understanding and deciding how do we bring change. And so, you know, in the first wave of white lash, way back, if you think about integration, and that definitely wasn't the first wave, but I'll just say it. You know, when we think about integration and the ways that children were used in this conversation, we see the same thing happening now when we think about critical race theory. There's so many videos that show that people actually cannot define what critical race theory is on both sides of the argument, that they don't even understand the 7 pillars of critical race theory and the founding and what it means and who's exposed to it and when do people learn it. And there's no conversation of learning. No one is using their prefrontal cortex to actually have a conversation and to understand. This term, white lash, is not mine. It's coined by Vance Jones. And he talks about the ways that there's retaliation for social justice movements, for Black people specifically. But I think that this idea and this concept of white lash isn't just generalized to white people. It's also, you know, when you see issues related to LGBTQIA+ rights, right? This backlash of people that have this big movement, and then when there's change, an entire community that was never engaged then has some backlash for it. And so what we see is this critical need for us to dismantle bias, prejudice, and racism. And I think these 4 core components are what we need so we don't just replicate another cultural consciousness wave next year. We need the values. We need to believe in equity, good intentions, a desire for diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. Great, beautiful. We also need skills. And this is the area that I have found that we are most lacking. The skills to connect, to identify, to repair ruptures, humility to sit and hear someone who you really don't agree with, and a questioning framework. I wonder why. What would lead this person who is so caring and loving in this one area to be in agreement with something that looks like hate? How does that make sense? Let me understand it. We need accountability and the resources linked with that accountability. And lastly, we need support. We cannot do this work in silos. So often this silo work is the silo work of DEIB people not engaging with other folks. It's the silo of the people who are like, I don't agree with this, not engaging with the DEIB work. We need allyship, we need co-conspirators, we need people that are willing to put their resources on the line. And you may be willing to put some resources on the line, but the other ones, like relationships and really engaging and being willing to have your heart broken by a conversation, but repairing it, this is what I'm talking about here. And so there are some critical components as you think about your goals for 2022 in your DEIB work. To be really clear, these are the elements that you should have just like knocked out of the park, and you should be just sharpening them. You need a formal DEI strategy. What is the plan? Where are you going? You need to ensure that you have executive leadership. It's not just bringing someone in to do a training. You have to be willing to raise the awareness. That's critical, right? We have to still have awareness. It's just insufficient alone. Awareness of our biases, our microaggressions, how do we minimize them? We have to make sure that people feel heard. This is the connection piece. And lastly, it might be partnering and doing consultation work with someone that is not in this every single day, that's not in your department, in your organization, in your division. And so I think that the strategy that I recommend, that I think is a best practice, is starting with a position, maybe a DEIB chief diversity officer, a director. That person is doing an assessment. They're going to help you build a strategy, and there are going to be resources given to that person and to that position. Next, there's a DEIB program, and there's accountability. There is an implementation strategy, like you're actually implementing that strategy. And then there are trainings. This is where training goes as a bullet on a 3-part plan. Lastly, once that DEIB program is in effect and it's moving, then you actually need to aim to dismantle it and move towards integration, where it's not DEIB work, it's not a DEIB program. Instead, it's just work. It's how we do what we do. So this is a strategic, sustainable action plan that is not emotion driven, that is not reactive. It is emotion informed, but it is not driven by the emotion, but instead we are anchoring it in a clear, strategic, sustainable plan. Now, change, when I think about this, cannot happen in a silo. We're going to have to start talking and having tender conversations in spaces that we maybe don't want to go in, that don't feel good, that are not the warm fuzzies that you get from really extracting out your own racism, prejudice, and bias and getting that stuff out of you. It feels good to not have that poison in us, to not have that infection, but it can't just happen alone with you. And I know that that's scary. To think about connecting in these ways. And so I thought, a nice way to maybe inspire us in that confronting of our fear, not eradicating it, this work is scary, is to really recognize the ways that we're walking in this together. And so what I decided would be nice is to have one of the most world-renowned opera singers, Brian McQueen, join us. And they're going to sing a song called You'll Never Walk Alone. And I have their bio here, and it's really lovely. And I'm going to just share a little bit of it because it's so expansive. Brian has appeared in the Lyric Opera Theater in Arizona, in Miami. They're affiliated with organizations in Japan. They've worked in South Carolina. They are a voice instructor in the Bronx. So many wonderful things. This QR code is to their website if you would like to find more information about them. And without further ado, we will end with Brian sharing a song, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Brian, if you would be so kind to unmute yourself and to come on camera, welcome. It's great to see you here. I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you for having me. As Dana said, I will be singing You'll Never Walk Alone by Richard Rogers. When you walk through the storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of the storm is a golden sky, and the sweet silver song of a lark. Walk on through the wind, walk on through the rain, though your dreams be tossed and blown. Walk on with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. You'll Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, if you would like to give us any feedback, this is a QR code. If you would like to reach out to me, this is all of my contact information. I'll also drop a link to this survey in the chat box, and I will stop sharing here and open it up for questions, comments, and feedback. Thank you all so much. Thank you again, Brian. Just thank you.
Okay, people, come on. It's time to ask your questions. How could you have listened to all of that, including that beautiful song? Oh, thank you, Brian. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Miss. Thank you. Oh my God. Please open up. The floor is open for all the questions. And until, there's a hand.
Yes,
Michelle?
Hi, can you hear me?
we can.
Yes.
Oh, terrific. First of all, my hats off to everyone there. Dr. Crawford, I am just such a big fan of yours. I don't know how you can retain all this information. I learn something new every time I see you. And I'm with the DOE, and it's just such a privilege to be able to listen to you. It encourages me in my daily walk and the things that I do and the people that I come up around and that I work with. My questions are just constant, and I just want to know, where can I go when I have things that come to me? You know, like in my days, I feel like I know I'm not alone. And thank you so much for choosing that song. I just want to know, you know, like I have daily wonderings and things that I want to do, and so where might someone like myself go to I guess to be able to have that experience?
Thank you so much, Michelle, for your kindness and your generous words, and for supporting this work, and for walking with me in this work. You know, I don't walk alone when you are there, even if I don't know you're there, and anyone else that shows up in these spaces. Where do you go? You know, I think I'm still struggling to find where the community is. I don't have an answer. I feel like I wish I had more time and resources to create more community. I thought a lot about I should probably have a listserv or a newsletter or a chat group or drop in or do Instagram Live, like all of these things, right? But I'm just also trying to make it. I have found the internet, Instagram. I have a lot of people that I follow there that really create beautiful spaces. I've also found my community in artists, in spoken word and open mics. But I think I'm still struggling to find that community too. It's an area in my life, especially when I became a mom. My community changed, and I'm still trying to find it. If you find it, send me a message so I could come.
Okay, I will. Thank you so much for that. And I'm the lady who beeps the horn at you sometimes when you're in Harlem, just so you know.
Lovely. I love it.
Awesome. More questions. Another hand. We see you, Rena.
Yeah.
Yes, peace and blessings. Thank you so much, my dear sisters and brothers. This is really something. And I'm 77 and I'm still searching for answers and still moving towards that. What I see, Doctor, is that we get the information from you. We get you are like the catalyst, and then we should continue with that. We do the studying and moving forward and starting the discussion groups in our environment, learning and spreading it. It's not up, this is in my opinion, it's not up to just one of us. It's up to the whole community. So I thank you so much. This is the third session that I'm in with you, and I'm looking to do more. I'm not in New York right now, but I'm native Harlemite, just in Georgia right now due to the pandemic. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our brothers and sisters who brought this to us. And peace and blessings, fellows, my sisters and brothers. Let's help and let's get the message out and make a difference.
Thank you so much. I'll take all those pieces and all that blessings. Like I from Georgia, yes, thank you. And I agree. I think if we all have a level of accountability, that if we all see ourselves as accountable, then change happens that way, you know? And I don't know, when you said you're 77 and you're still looking for answers, I was a little bit heartbroken. I was like, I thought I could be done. Like, I'm not gonna be 77 and had an answer yet, Rena. Like, oh, I guess we all gonna have to keep working. Thank you.
Come on, more hands. And to that 77 comment, what I want to say is that I think it's wonderful that she's still wanting to learn and to continue to give back. I don't ever want to stop learning. I just see this as such a gift to have the desire to want to know more. Mm-hmm. And while we're waiting for the other hands to come up, I can tell you seriously, as I listened to your presentation today, Dr. Crawford, there were so many questions that I didn't know that I had in the back of my mind, my head, that you answered. And yeah, and I didn't even know they were there. And as you were talking, I started taking notes for myself of things that I was going to do after this session. I think as we open ourselves up to presentations like this, where it talks about moving forward, really, it to me, it was a presentation of hope. And as we continue to do this, I think as we're being quiet within ourselves, I think solutions continue to surface. I really do. And we're not doing this alone. We never walk alone. We have each other. I mean, we have people currently online. We have each other. This is wonderful. And we can reach out to each other, and together we can work this out together. So anyone else, come on, we've got about 5 minutes and we have this awesome individual here who's here to answer any questions, or at least try. So we've got the floor for another 5 minutes.
Yes, I want to comment. I see this this question. It's more of a comment though, about how someone felt when this white man was saying he was being forgotten in this anger. And you know, I don't want to come off as if I don't have righteous rage, right? That's what I call it. It's righteous rage. I got reasons to be mad, right? But it's also, you know, about what happens after that. You know, like the anger is real. So what I didn't share in what happened yesterday with this presentation is that the person was like, well, you know, just do it our way. And I actually said, no, you know, what I'll do, because you already advertised it, you already emailed it, my name is associated, and I don't want to just cancel because we had like 4 minutes left. I said, what I'll do is when we get to the breakout session where I give the instructions, I'll say, you know, your organization doesn't feel comfortable with you all having these conversations in small groups without a moderator. They don't feel like you can do that. If you want to have these conversations on your own, here are some tips, here are some techniques and some ways that you can engage. But I want to be clear that in my best practice, I think you should move your jaw and have these conversations at work. And then you're going to come back and we're going to have a large group space and then we're going to talk about it. And if things didn't go right in your breakout, you're going to talk about that, right? And then we're going to deal with it as a community. And the person who invited me to present, he said, no, you don't say that. Let's just go ahead and cancel. And so like at this point, like 100 people came in on the platform and we're having this conversation and he canceled it. He got 100 of his staff to come and he'd rather cancel it than let them have a conversation. And so, you know, when I think about this work, what it requires is the courage and the trust that people can have hard conversations that may, I'm not, you know, Pollyanna-ish. I recognize they may, or Polly, to shout outs to Rudy Huxtable. I grew up on that Polly. I'm not so naive to think that hard conversations will always go well. But I know that if people don't have hard conversations, hard things won't change.
That's powerful. I should just take all your quotes. They're so
I
amazing.
write down my quotes. I'm gonna take my quotes when I'm like, oh, that was good. Let me.
Yes, that was really good. You need a quote book. You need to do that. Here's a question. When we're dealing with large scale organizational DEI work, what are the best responses for slow moving progress?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's where strategy becomes really important, right? So when you have a strategy and it's a measurable, we all know SMART goals, then you can look at a grid and see, where are we? Okay, we aim to be here by November. We're not there. Why not? What's happening? What's the barrier? And then address it. But if you're just like, things aren't moving and it's just kind of casual and it's not strategic, then you don't have the power to do that. So my recommendation is that you would look at your assessment that you did, right? Or you would do an assessment, and then you would evaluate, what is the barrier? Why is this work not moving at the pace that it should? And are there things that we need to adjust? Maybe it was unrealistic to think that people could just come and have a town hall and talk about racism, and they've never done that before in their entire life, or people don't feel safe, or they don't have resources, and people don't know if they are going to have a job after COVID, but you want me to come and talk about racism, and I'm not sure if my kid's going to have enough to eat. No. We have to always be recognizing Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And one of the biggest things that we need is like food, water, shelter, right? And so there may be things like that that are barriers. This is humanitarian work. And so if we're thinking about humanitarian work, it's thinking about, what are the things that humans need? And so if the work isn't moving fast enough, it may be some core human needs, some organizational needs, some employee needs that are not being addressed. And so having a strategy allows you to then strategically analyze your progress and then adjust and then make plans.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. Do we have another thought, Elijah, or anything before we have to close out? Because it's 12:59. Can you believe this?
We have one more from Maya.
Okay, please share.
All right. It says, one second.
I see it.
Yeah.
So this frustration when big organizations talk the talk and don't want to walk the walk. Is that the one, Elijah?
Mm-hmm.
They say all the right things about their values, but it doesn't show up in their practice. So this is a space where, if we go back to the first training where we talked about authenticity, right? So authenticity is the willingness to be truthful yourself. What am I about? What are my values? And being willing to look at the organization and say, what are their values? What are the things that they're really living? So say you're working for a big organization and they're talking the talk, but they're not doing it. What you need to do is think about for yourself, can I accept this truth? Can I work for this organization? Can I get some different resources? Do I need to move to a different place? Do I need to, call out a certain way? Do I need to, have a meeting asking these questions rather than like, see, they just talk. So that's why I don't go to those trainings. That's why I'm not in that workshop. And then you just check out, right? So the authenticity is about being honest with yourself about what you're saying and what you're going to do about it. I've had to quit whole jobs. Yesterday I missed the whole training because I refused. I was like, you want me to do it this way? I'm not doing it that way. This is what I will compromise and this is what I won't. It was a lot of money too, y'all. I was like, integrity is expensive. Nobody told me integrity was gonna cost so much. I don't know what you did for Kwanzaa this year. We gonna make it.
But also worth it.
Exactly.
Listen, we're at the end for today. Don't worry. We will be getting Dr. Crawford back here. She hasn't said yes yet because we haven't made that official ask, but she's coming back. Please watch out for our notices. We know that you could have spent your hour anyplace else, but you chose to spend it with us. And for that, we're forever grateful. And we're so appreciative of the fact that you are allowing us to take this journey with you, because it really is a journey and we're doing it together. So we want you to have the best day ever. Please take care of yourself. Dr. Crawford, thank you so much. Brian, oh my goodness. It was just so yummy. And I took lots of notes. Hope you did the same. Have the best day ever, everyone. See you next month.
Thank you all.